Hi, I'm John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by the Century's own poetry editor, Jill Peláez Baumgaertner. A brand new book has just come out featuring poetry from our magazine. The book is called Taking Root in the Heart. We're going to be talking about that book along with a launch event that's coming up. But first, Jill, hello, great to see you. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you, John, for having me here. It's great to be a part of this community at the Christian Century, and actually to be a part of the community of poets that the Christian Century has developed over the past few years. I, for 37 years, was an English professor and Dean of Humanities and Theological Studies at Wheaton College, and retired in 2017, went back as acting provost for a term and then retired again. And since then, my entire life really has been poetry. It has been a delight, and I now look back at those years of administering and wonder what in the world I was doing that. So that's a little bit about me. This book came about, well, I started thinking about it after I'd been poetry editor for about, 10 years, 12 years, and thought at the beginning that maybe what I should do is go back 100 years into the journal and look at the poetry, because Christian Century, even when it was back in the days when it was the Christian Oracle, published poetry. So I went back and I discovered two things in the brittle, thin pages that I looked through. One was that Christian Century did publish excellent poetry, but a lot of it was reprinted. A lot of it was from like Christina Rossetti and Alfred Lord Tennyson, and that wasn't quite what I had in mind. And the poetry that was original to the time wasn't necessarily, well, how can I say it, up to snuff according to contemporary aesthetic standards. So I gave up the idea. And because what I began to think is, oh, how conceited this is. I'm thinking that the only good poetry in the century was published during the time I was poetry editor. And but Amy Frickholm and Elizabeth Palmer, editors at the Century, convinced me that no, I really should do the past 25 years. And so I concentrated on the past 25 years while I've been poetry editor, went through it, found 34 poets who had published a lot with us, and had to leave out so many good poems and good poets. I have a whole other volume I could put together. And this is what resulted. These 34 poets, about 200 pages of poetry.
That's great. Well, maybe I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but maybe someday volume two will hit the shelves. But Jill, I think you've picked out a couple poems that you really love from this collection. So why don't you go ahead and read one of those for us now, if that's all right?
Okay. This poem is both light and serious, which is what Stephen Peterson specializes in. He's a local poet and playwright, actually, and it's called Falling. It wasn't nice. No, wasn't nice to be called in the garden by God. He called us once, he called us twice. Was no answer a thing he thought odd? He must have known we were his own. He presumably knew what we did. Or was he stunned by what we'd done? We refusedly shut up and hid. That's us inside. We hide, as he's calling our names in the dusk. And though we all regret the fall, to be falling is thrilling to us.
Oh, that's a great one. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Mm.
Um, I think one thing that's cool, I think, when I hear about you and the work that you do at the Century, is that you're not just working with the poems themselves, but the poets and forming some relationships. So I'm sure this was cool for you, this project, to not only bring great poems together in a collection, but these people you've been cultivating relationships with over years.
That's really true. Before the pandemic, we actually had a group started on Friday afternoons in the Century Library. A small group of local poets would get together. We had planned to continue that, and I hope I pick that up again. Um, Little workshops that we would put together, bring a poem that we've written and a poem that we would like some input on, and a poem written by somebody else that we really appreciate. Keep that conversation going. I have this dream that this group of poets that we've collected in this volume and that have been publishing in the Century over the past 25 years will have formed a new school of poetry called the Christian Arts Poetry School. It's not that every poem is a poem of faith. We publish a lot of poems that have no reference to faith. But these are people who take their faith seriously and have also found that the publishing world is not necessarily congenial place for their work. In fact, the publishing world is often allergic to this kind of poetry. There are journals of Christian poetry that we would not want to put our poems in, and we don't, of course, become one of those. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about just your role at the Christian Century as poetry editor. What do you do week in and week out in that role? What do you love about it? Just anything you'd like to share with us about what it's like to serve in that role.
yes, most poems now are submitted online. I do get a few hard copy submissions, but I prefer the online submission. And I get maybe 50 to 75 poems a week. I go through them usually daily. I spend at least an hour on these poems. With some poems, I know right away by line 2 or 3 that it's just not going to work. Other poems are very intriguing, and I put them aside and come back to them. If I find a poem that I think is something I'm very interested in including in the Century, but it has a problem or two, I will actually via email, talk to the poet about it, make some suggestions. And usually what they do is follow my lead and make the changes, and then I accept the poem. Sometimes not, and sometimes they have good reason for not following my suggestions, and sometimes they're very right not to. So that's what it is. I get some pushback occasionally. The wild occasional email that is terribly offended that I rejected their poem, but that doesn't happen that often. I'm usually these poets are grateful for the opportunity to submit, and their work is good.
Yeah. It's remarkable the volume of poetry you receive. I'm glad so many people out there are making poetry and that they want to publish it in our magazine. Um, okay, the book has just launched, and there's actually going to be a launch event, a celebration coming up May 11th in Chicago. Could you tell us a little bit for those who may be in the Chicago area or want to travel there who might be interested in coming for a night of poetry? Can you tell us what to expect at this event?
I am thrilled with the way the Christian Century has picked this up and run with it. The launch is May 11th, 7 p.m. at the Arts Club of Chicago. And we are featuring the British poet Malcolm Guite. We have published him. He's actually has entries in the book, in the anthology. He is quite the sensation these days. He is everywhere, and he is he particularly is a fine sonnet writer. Did an amazing book called The Crown of David. And this happened during the pandemic when he realized that corona, which was the virus, was also a sonnet sequence in which the last line of one sonnet becomes the first line of the next sonnet, and they're linked that way. So he decided he'd write a corona based upon all 150 Psalms. And so he wrote a meditation on each Psalm. And the surprise is that the last line of each one of these meditations becomes the first line of the next meditation on a Psalm, which might not have anything to do with what the previous one did. It's just brilliant. He calls that the Crown of David.
Wow, that does sound pretty remarkable. Okay, so we will have a link in the video description below where people can check out this event and decide if they would like to come join us to launch this book. But before we close out our time here, I think you've selected another poem that you would like to read from the collection. So please go ahead and read that, Jill.
This is a poem by Anya Silver. Anya was such a good friend of everyone in poetry. She was a professor at Mercer University. She received many awards for her poetry, including a Guggenheim right before she died. She had metastatic breast cancer for 14 years. It was diagnosed while she was pregnant with her one and only child, Noah. And this is one of my favorite heart-wrenching poems of hers. It's called Psalm 137 for Noah. Come, darling, sit by my side and weep. I have no lyre, no melodious voice or chant. I meditate on the Zion I could never grant you. My son, my roe deer, my rock-rent stream, my honeysuckle, my salt, my golden spear. Forgive me your birth in this strange land. I wanted your infant kisses, your fists clasped round my neck. I craved you, though you were born in the wake of my illness, my dim prognosis. I was selfish. I willed you this woe, this world. You inherited exile for my sake.
Wow. Wow. That is a powerful poem. Thank you for sharing that with us. Whew. Well, Jill, this has been lovely. And thank you so much for joining us. Everyone out there, if you're interested in any of this, there'll be plenty of links below in the video description. You'll be able to order the book, Taking Root in the Heart. You'll be able to learn more about the event on May 11th. And we'll also throw down there the link for Jill's website where she features some of her own poetry. Thank you, Jill. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you so much, John.